This photographer was an absolute badass maniac. He played an integral part in the formation of Magnum Photos. He captured images of some of the most historically significant moments of World War II, including D-Day at Omaha Beach, the Battle of the Bulge, and the liberation of Paris. He had notable interactions with Pablo Picasso, Ernest Hemingway, and Henri Cartier-Bresson. In 1938, he became known as the greatest war photographer in the world, through a 26-photograph spread of his images that were made during the Spanish Civil War. He made a monumental impact on the world of photography in his 40 years on this earth, and will continue to impact street, documentary, and war photographers forever, if not exclusively through his work, then at the very least, through the quote that he is so well known for, and the words that he lived by to the point that resulted in the end of his life while working in the field of conflict photography. If your photographs aren't good enough, you're not close enough. This is Street Smarts Volume 36, Robert Capa. This video is brought to you by Dehancer Film Emulation. Death in the Making is a book that involved not only Robert Capa, but his partner, Gerda Taro, who is credited as being the first female photojournalist to be killed while on assignment in the field. David Chim Seymour, who was another Magnum Photos founder, but not credited for his photos in the book until much later. Historically noteworthy photographer Andre Kurdish, who was involved in designing the layout, and journalist Jay Allen, who created the foreword for the book, and is known as a writer for the Chicago Tribune, who was also a foreign correspondent during the Spanish Civil War. The book was a tribute to the anti-fascists who fought against Franco's supporters in the war, and was a piece of propaganda meant to raise awareness for them, as the war continued to rage on while the book was being produced. Death in the Making was not initially widely distributed, but became highly regarded for its coverage of a wide variety of material that related to the conflict, and an arc of what happened throughout the duration of Robert Capa and Gerda Taro's involvement in photographing it, which was an unusual way of presenting conflict photography at the time. This included the swell of enthusiasm for the effort as it began, people contributing to that effort, fighting that took place in Madrid, the fear that came as a byproduct of some of the world's earliest air raids, as well as the dead and wounded that resulted from the conflict. This book also included one of Robert Capa's most renowned photos, titled The Falling Soldier, which is known as one of the greatest war photos of all time, because it was the first widely published photo of its kind. It helped define what high-quality photojournalism could look like. The reason it was so highly regarded was because it showed the moment of death in a way that had not been seen before. However, the photo has come over an intense amount of scrutiny, with many claiming that it was staged. People on both sides of the debate are adamant that it was or was not faked. In the long term, this may have only made the photo grow in popularity as a result of the discourse around it. Robert Capa was part of two different groups that sought refuge in Europe in the 1930s, in search of places with more democratic ideals. One group of the creatives and thinkers, and the other being people of Jewish descent. He was born in Budapest, but left at the age of 20, after being influenced by other Hungarian photographers Brassai and Kurdish to move to Paris, which he ended up doing in 1933. Once there, he wanted to play a role in documenting the world around him, which was obviously undergoing dramatic changes at the time in the lead up to World War II. His first instinct was to do this through journalism, but he quickly realized that he could not produce the kind of high-quality writing required to impact the world in the way that he wanted to. So he turned to photography, where he thought he'd have a better shot at producing work that would have an impact. One of the first jobs he was given was to photograph Leon Trotsky in Copenhagen, which gave him access to the political arena that he wanted to be involved in. These are the first steps he would take towards all that he would document throughout his exhilarating but short 20-year career. In the same year that Robert Capa documented the Spanish Civil War, he was also heavily involved in documenting what was going on in France. From 1936 to 1939, he took photos of political gatherings of various groups on Bastille Day, a rally to promote peace between France and Russia, various worker strikes, people on the streets of Marseille, peace marches to commemorate the 20-year anniversary of the end of World War I, the Tour de France, and various other moments of reportage of France in the lead up to World War II. All of these photos show his development as a photojournalist in preparation of what was to come in the following years. What followed were three major events photographed by Robert Capa during World War II that are incredibly important in regard to lending context to the war, as anyone looks back at it through a historic lens. Capturing these images must have been horrifically difficult, and they make a clear case for how dedicated Robert Capa was to allowing others to see what war looked like in an up-close and personal fashion. Magnum Photos' book, Magnum Stories, credits Robert Capa's work by stating, "Almost single-handedly, He created Magnum's tradition of photographic storytelling, and it is a testament to the reputation he forged for the photojournalist as narrative hero that Magnum continues to be associated with. He was able to do this by taking risks that allowed him to be in the right place at the right time, by building relationships with those on the front lines that give him access to those places, and having an unbelievable amount of courage to do so. But some of what was involved in making these photos is up for debate. Capa himself knew that some instances were blown up to convey an atmosphere around what he was covering to make himself appear larger than life, stating, "Writing the truth being obviously so difficult, I have in the interest of it allowed myself to go sometimes slightly beyond and slightly this side of it." His storytelling methods that allowed him to blur the lines between myth-making and reality were also a driving factor in turning Magnum Photos into the monolith of photography that it is today, because the stories told by the photographers within the group were able to be elevated to more intriguing levels by following this methodology on the storytelling front to some extent. This video is brought to you by Dehancer Film Emulation, a plugin to help photographers and videographers achieve the look of film through digital means within the following software. For more information on how Dehancer can help you achieve the look of film on your frames by adding authentic and tested looks, compression, grain, halation, bloom, and more, check the link in the description. The first of the major events of World War II that Capa covered was the storming of Omaha Beach by Allied forces on D-Day in 1944. Capa opens his recounting of this event stating, "I'm a gambler. I decided to go with Company E in the first wave." And he continues in a voice that brings viewers of the photos with him to feel the impact of their compositions more pressingly. The coast of Normandy was still miles away when the first unmistakable popping reached our listening ears. We ducked down in a pucky water in the bottom of the barge and ceased to watch the approaching coastline. The first empty barge, which had already unloaded its troops on the beach, passed us on the way back to the chase, and the boatswain gave us a happy grin and the V sign. It was now late enough to start taking pictures, and I brought my first Context camera out in its waterproof oilskin. The flat bottom of our barge hit the earth of France. The boatswain lowered the steel-covered barge front, and there, between the grotesque designs of the steel obstacles sticking out of the water, was a thin line of land covered with smoke. Our Europe, the easy red beach. His writing continues in this voice, as an incredibly appealing first-hand account of his experiences that day in 1944, with statements like, "Waist deep, with rifles ready to shoot, with the invasion obstacles and the smoking beach in the background. This was good enough for the photographer. And, between floating bodies, I reached it, paused for a few more pictures, and gathered my guts for the last jump to the beach." Additionally, during the end of his anecdote, "Then I took some shots of the crew giving transfusions on the open deck. An invasion barge came alongside and took us off the sinking boat. The transfer of the badly wounded on heavy seas was a difficult business. I took no more pictures. I was busy lifting stretchers. The barge brought us to the USS Chase. The last wave of the 16th Infantry was just being lowered, but the decks were already full of returning wounded and dead." Capa shot multiple rolls of film on this day, and sadly, most of them were lost because of processing problems in the darkroom. Only 11 photos turned out, and they are known as the Magnificent 11. The second significant event of World War II photographed by Robert Capa was the Battle of the Bulge. This battle is seen as the turning point of World War II, because it was the last time Nazi Germany would be on the offensive in the Western Front. It was also the largest and bloodiest battle that the United States were involved in throughout their time in the war in Europe, with casualties ranging between 80 and 100,000 for the German forces, and around 75,000 for the Allies. But numbers vary from source to source. Robert Capa's final account of the battle, after all was said and done, was this: "The Germans were tough in their well-prepared fortress, but not so tough that they fought to the last German. Only to the first American they got close enough to be dangerous. Then, they threw up their hands, shouted 'Comrade,' and asked for cigarettes." The final major event that Robert Capa covered in World War II was the liberation of Paris on August 19, 1944. Henri Cartier-Bresson and George Roger, who were two other founding members of Magnum Photos, were also there on that day. Now back in the city he had called home before the war, Robert Capa stated, "The road to Paris was open, and every Parisian was out in the street to touch the first tank, to kiss the first man, to sing and cry. Never were there so many who were so happy, so early in the morning. I felt that this entry into Paris had been made especially for me. on a tank made by Americans who had accepted me, riding with the Spanish Republicans with whom I had fought against fascism long years ago. I was returning to Paris, the beautiful city where I first learned to eat, to drink, to love. Somehow, Robert Capa was able to survive World War II physically unscathed, but his luck would run out roughly 10 years later. In 1947, Robert Capa worked alongside John Steinbeck to create a book titled A Russian Journal. It was made as they traveled for 40 days through what is known as the Vodka Circuit of Moscow, Kiev, Stalingrad, and Georgia, with the intention of honest reporting to set down what we saw and heard with editorial comment, without drawing conclusions about things we didn't know sufficiently. The draw to document these places came from the rising tensions of the Cold War that left a mysterious air of what was going on behind the Iron Curtain, in terms of the people without any historic aspects, politics, or in-depth analysis that would have been found in Western newspapers at the time. However, their freedom to do as they pleased on the trip was limited to a schedule designed by a state-sanctioned official, who had to be with them at all times. They were only allowed to take this trip in the first place because it was meant to improve relations between the United States and the USSR. Throughout the course of this trip, Capa created several thousand negatives, and Steinbeck wrote hundreds of pages of notes. It was not either man's natural tendency to work collaboratively, but Steinbeck sung his praises about Capa's photographic abilities, stating, "He could photograph motion and gaiety and heartbreak. He could photograph thought. Know how he captures the endlessness of the Russian landscape and one single human. See how his lens could peer through the eyes into the mind of a man." This was also a reflection of the experience they had while in the USSR. The mindset of the time would have led them to believe that terrible things awaited them beyond the Iron Curtain, but they had nothing but positive things to say about the people they met on their travels, speaking to their hope and strength despite the conditions they found themselves living under. Steinbeck also reflected that it was difficult for Capa to photograph their journey because of the high intensity he had become used to during the days of World War II. A chapter in the book called A Legitimate Complaint was set aside for Capa to reflect on this. The 190 million Russians are against me. They are not holding wild meetings on street corners, do not practice spectacular free love, do not have any kind of new look. They are very righteous, moral, hardworking people. For a photographer, as dull as an apple piece. My 4 cameras, used to war and revolution, are disgusted, and every time I click them, something goes wrong. Beginning in 1948 until 1950, Robert Capa spent time in Israel to document conflicts that arose as the Declaration of Independence was created there. Unfortunately, it's difficult to find any clear-cut narrative about the production of these photos that isn't tainted by the never-ending conflict between Palestine and Israel. What you'll come across are glorious accounts of how Robert Capa captured the birth of a new nation from the Israeli perspective, and accounts from the other side of how he cemented the beginning of the loss of Palestinian connection to the place. Whatever your political leanings, you'll find some information that supports your side of the debate. That being said, from my search into the subject, resources on the creation of these images are rather limited. From a completely speculative side, I would imagine that these images would have held serious weight for Robert Capa, given that he was of Jewish descent and was displaced as a result of the turmoil placed on Jewish people in World War II. But again, that's purely speculation. In 1954, Robert Capa traveled to Japan for a Magnum exhibition. Since he was in the region, Life magazine sent him to document the conflict taking place in Vietnam. As the group he was with came under fire, he walked up a road to photograph the combat, at which time he stepped on a landmine and died at the age of 41. After his death, his brother stated he died on a non-important road, in a non-important action. It had to be fate for him to do that. From my perspective, there's no doubt that he had died doing what he lived to do, with a camera in his hands, in the midst of a conflict. Thanks to Dehancer for sponsoring this video. If you want to know how to use their plugin to get the look of film on your digital photo and video, check the link in the description. Thanks for watching. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe. And until next time, keep developing.